Thanks, very kind. I'm very happy to speak after Steve because I want to start where he started, which is talking about capitalism. I'm not going to talk about education. I'm not even going to say that much about neoliberalism. What I want to talk about is capitalism because we have to understand the full meaning of what's going on at the present time. We are currently in the worst crisis that capitalism as a system has experienced in our lifetimes. Unless there's anyone who's over 70 here, and even I'm not over 70. This isn't just another turn of the business cycle, another of the regular recessions that capitalism has experienced throughout its history as part of its inner logic. This is a much deeper and more serious crisis than that. The American Keynesian economist Paul Krugman has called it the Third Depression, comparing it to that at the end of the 19th century and also, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s. So what we're confronting and experiencing and suffering the consequences of, most importantly, is a systemic crisis. It arises out of the fact that capitalism, since I would say the end of the 1960s, has been experiencing a protracted crisis of overaccumulation and profitability. What does that mean in simple language? What it means is there's too much capital seeking profits relative to the profits that are extracted from workers. The rate of profit, the return on capitalist investment is too low. And what neoliberalism has been about is trying to restore the profitability of capitalism. David Harvey, in a book called A History of Neoliberalism, a short history of neoliberalism, has said that neoliberalism is about restoring class power. And how they try to do that is, above all, by squeezing workers as hard as possible, exploiting workers even more than they were anyway. And to some extent they were successful in that, but not enough. Not enough. If you look at the rate of profit in the major capitalist economies like the United States, Britain, Germany, Japan, and so on, it's still much lower than it was in the economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s. And this is where finance comes in. I think that what happened wasn't a plan or plot, it's simply something that evolved over a matter of time, that the people who run the system, who manage the system, came to see or came to believe that if they allowed the financial markets to run out of control by deregulation and so on, and to blow up huge speculative bubbles, that could act as a mechanism for driving capitalism as an economy. We could see it happening during the boom and bubble that preceded the present crisis. What it involved, in particular, was a bubble in the housing market. In other words, house prices rose. And that meant that if you were lucky enough to own a house, you felt better off. You could borrow more against the price of your house because it had risen. And borrowing more, you could spend more. And that spending helped to sustain the economy. The problem was that those kind of speculative bubbles only last a certain period of time. They always burst, and in the case of this bubble, which was a particularly big one, the result was the biggest financial crash probably since the outbreak of the First World War, since 1914, and it helped to precipitate the deepest economic slump since the Second World War. So lots of records being broken with the kind of economic crisis that we're confronting. Now, what happened then was that the leading capitalist states sought to rescue the system, essentially by pumping as much money as they could, particularly into the banks, but also through more general economic stimuluses. That prevented a collapse on the scale of the Great Depression of the 1930s, but it didn't end the crisis, and it, in fact, introduced new dimensions to the crisis, the so-called crisis of sovereign debt, that now is the justification for the kind of austerity policies being pursued here, not just here, but throughout the rest of the advanced capitalist economies. In other words, governments increased spending, they borrowed more in order to finance the spending, and now the banks, rescued by the state, are turning on the state and saying, you're borrowing too much, cut the budget deficit, cut public spending. Now, this is an act of class injustice because the people who are being made to pay for the crisis, namely working people, the poor, students, aren't responsible for the crisis. No one pretends that, say, all of you somehow precipitated the crisis. We didn't cause the crisis, but we're being expected to pay for the crisis. What's involved in austerity, I think, is not something that's dictated by any economic necessity, as has been explained in other sessions. What it is about is putting neoliberalism back in place, because neoliberalism was broken by the crisis, was ideologically discredited. They had to turn back to the state to save the system. But neoliberalism has worked brilliantly for the rich. It's led to unbelievable amounts of money pouring into the coffers of the rich. And they want to maintain that situation. And that's what austerity is about. Austerity is about clamping back neoliberalism in place in a more radical form than it actually existed in the first place. The present coalition is going much further than even Margaret Thatcher dared to do in the 1980s. So what we're talking about is an attempt to rescue the system, and particularly the version of the system that has done so well for the rich, at the expense of the mass of us. There are all sorts of divisions on their side. Don't think that they're unified. I mean, the latest attempt to rescue the Eurozone involved a huge row among European Union leaders, with Trichet, the head of the European Central Bank, being denounced in private and in public by Sarkozy, the French president. Trichet was worried that the latest rescue plan will actually make the crisis worse, and Sarkozy said, don't bother us with that inconvenient facts like that. So they're divided on their own side. How much longer have I got? What? A minute. And they are facing resistance of the kind that we've seen in France and Greece. But I think the one thing I want to emphasise is lots of people say, oh, look at, there's something genetic about the French and the Greeks, which mean they go on strike, they protest, and so on and so forth. We British are just useless. We just complain and have another cup of tea and so on. This is nonsense. I'm old. One of the advantages of being old is I can remember London being blacked out by the miners' strike in 1972. I can remember the dockers. I can remember the dockers freeing their leaders in defiance of the law in the summer of 1972. The British workers have a long history of struggle and insurrection that they can be very, very proud of. The problem was neoliberalism started here with Thatcher in the 1980s. It was beaten, it was implemented particularly brutally, and the workers' movement in this country suffered a series of defeats, above all that of the miners in the mid-1980s. And really the shadow of those defeats has pervaded all attempts to build resistance in this country ever since. But history isn't a destiny that constrains us and stops us making things different in the future. In fact, I think this is the moment. This is our opportunity. I mean, Cameron and Clegg believe that they've seized the opportunity of the crisis to clamp back neoliberalism. But it's an opportunity for us as well. This is the moment at which we can break the cycle of defeat that anyone struggling for change in this country has had to grapple with for the last 20 or 30 years. We can develop protests, occupations, strikes that can break this government and its policies.